This is a WUFI Passive tutorial on creating a roof assembly. In WUFI Passive, there's multiple places to create assemblies. I'm going to show you how to create assembly in the database. So I'm going to go to Database, Assemblies, and open that up. I'm going to click New in the center column, and now it pops open this screen. The first thing I'm going to do is go to the Catalog tab at the top and put this in the appropriate catalog. The second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to name this assembly. So let's take a look at what we're going to build. So we're going to be building this roof assembly. Let's call it a 2x10 with 5 inches of polyiso on top. And we have blown in fiberglass insulation here and polyiso here. It looks like a TJI, but for the purposes of this example, let's call it a 2x10. Okay, so I'm going to call this 2x10 framed roof, 5 inches polyiso above. Or sometimes I'll start it with roof and call it 2x10 with fiberglass, 5 inches polyiso. Something like that. Something where you can read that and you can understand what the roof actually is that you've built, rather than going into the assembly and determining that. Okay, so in the assembly screen, you kind of see the layers, or you see the section here I'm pointing to that where you build the layers. So I'm going to go from outside to inside. So first, from the outside, I'm going to add the polyiso. When it says outside to inside, it means outside of the thermal boundary to the inside of the thermal boundary. So when I'm looking at my assembly, I'm starting on the very outer side of the thermal boundary. In this case, I'm calling that the polyiso. So I added a new layer, open my material database, search for polyiso board, or polyiso, picked the board, and I applied that. So now I'm going to change the thickness to 5 inches. You'll see that's the only entry you can actually change here. And that's giving me about R30, which seems pretty appropriate for polyiso, roughly R6 per inch. Okay, I'm going to go to New now, and we're going to add that next material. So let's take a quick look at our drawing. We have plywood below the polyiso, so I'm going to go to my material database, or I click to New, and it prompts open the material database. I select plywood, and I'm going to go ahead and pick Plywood USA, apply that, and add my 1/2 inch of plywood. Or, sorry, 5/8 inch of plywood. 0.625 inches here. Okay, I'm going to continue on now, and we're going to add our 2x10 layer of fiberglass. So I'm going to click New, search for fiber, F-I-B-R-E, in the WUFI database. Fiberglass here, apply. And I'm going to do 9.25 inches because that's the actual dimension of a 2x10. 9.25. And then my last layer here, I'm going to click New one more time, and I'm going to click or find gypsum board. So just search GYP, select USA, and apply. And I'm going to put 1/2 inch here and just refer back to the drawing and make sure that's correct. Now we're going to do actually a 5/8 inch chipboard. Again, this would be based on your particular project's drawings. Okay, so now on the far right, you can use this all drop down, and you can see we built out the layers here. So we have polyiso, we have plywood, fiberglass, and gypsum board. But we don't have any framing. So when we go to add framing, we need to figure out first kind of what portion of roof we're looking at. So in this particular sense, we could say, okay, let's cut it off at the spacing of the framing here. So I called it 2x10s. So let's cut it off at the spacing of the 2x10s. So this might be, let's say, 2 feet. Maybe a little bit, maybe a little closer. But we're gonna call it 2 feet. Actually might be 30 inches. Okay. So we're gonna say the roof, we're gonna add framing every 2 feet, and it's going to be going in one direction. So if we look back at this, the framing is just going in this direction. So it doesn't actually matter what direction we cut the framing or we cut our portion in the other direction. So in this particular case, we could make it the whole dimension of this building if we're assuming framing is running one direction for every 2 feet, and then it's running the other direction, maybe at the top and the bottom. For our purposes, we're just going to add framing in the one dominant direction, the consistent direction. So let's go back. So to define this, I need to add a horizontal subdivision, and I'm adding that in my PHIUS layer. Generally, when I'm defining the dimensions of an assembly, I'm adding these into a layer that doesn't have framing. So I just go into a layer, a sheathing layer or the first layer, and I define the assembly size that I want to look at. So I'm going to say it's 24 inches on center, and I don't actually care how long it goes in the Y direction in this particular case, because there's not consistent framing in the other direction. So we could define something if we wanted, but we're not adding framing in that direction, so I'm not going to. So now we have 24 inches in this direction, the X direction here, and in the Y direction there's the default height. Okay, so now I'm going to go into the fiberglass layer, the only layer in this assembly that has framing. And I'm going to make now a new cut for my trusses or for my framing. So I'm going to click New in the horizontal direction, and what that's going to do is make a cut in this 24 inches. So I'm going to have one piece for the framing and one piece for the remaining insulation. And what I'm doing is lining up framing on the edge of this 24-inch slice so that you could picture a roof, and it's just these repeated slices just like this. 24 inches on center of this roof we're looking at here. So now you see in the bottom left there's this 1.5 inch slice, and the 22.5 inches remain here. In order to actually assign the exchange material or the framing, we need to add an exchange material. So that's in this section here. So I'm going to click on Add, and I'm going to search for wood and pick the softwood option for framing. Now I can see softwood shows up in my exchange materials. I click on softwood, I click on my 1.5 inch slice, and now I've assigned that to softwood. And you can see over here now on the right, this is kind of how this would be represented in the roof if I wanted to look at it in the proper direction. The bottom here now is the gypsum board on the inside. Then I have 2x10 framing. Then I have my plywood. Then I have my polyiso. But no matter what direction you're making an assembly in, it will show up like this, where you're building layers in this X direction. But really, in reality, we're about to take it into our model, and it's going to be applied flat. But you can see in each assembly what orientation or what inclination it thinks the assembly's at. So it's fine that it looks like a wall, but actually it's a roof in this case. So it actually is going to be applied like this. One last thing here is you can see at the top now the total thermal resistance was calculated. So on the right hand side you have the thermal resistance without the framing, which comes out to almost R70, and then with the framing is roughly R67. So I'm going to click OK, and now I've created this roof.